It's 8:47 now on this Wednesday morning. John Waters in studio. And joining me for the talk show this morning, Congressman Ken Buck. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Well, doing well. Glad to have you on the show. I always appreciate when you're able to make time to come on the show. And again, I do appreciate that very much. Well, we have some topics to talk about. Of course, nothing at all going on in the news, but I think we found a few things we can talk about. Of course, I'm being facetious there. The first of those, Congressman, I wanted to get your thoughts, opinions on the Iranian nuclear deal that the Secretary of State, John Kerry, quote unquote, negotiated, and the president making what seems to be an end run around you all in Congress and going straight to the UN.
Well, I wouldn't call it a negotiation. I would call it a capitulation. The Iranian deal is a bad deal. The process is a bad process that we are now engaged in. I voted against the process. I believe this is a treaty. It should go to the United States Senate. It should receive, if it's going to be approved, it should receive a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Instead, we will pass a resolution opposing this treaty in the House. They will pass it in the Senate. It will be vetoed by the president, and then we will have a 2/3 majority to overcome this treaty as opposed to support it. But the treaty does three things that are really bad. One, it assures that Iran will get a nuclear weapon. Two, it encourages nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia will go get a nuclear weapon. Egypt, Jordan, other countries. And three, and the most immediate effect that this bad treaty will have is that Iran will receive $150 billion, and that jolt to their economy will give them more than enough money to encourage terrorism, fund terrorism around the world. And they have indicated a desire to do that, a commitment to do that, and I think this is just a foolhardy venture by a foolish president.
Well, in pretty much every way, it seems like this treaty, this deal does exactly the opposite of what we need and what we want.
I think it does. The president believes that this will give him some sort of legacy. I think the legacy that's going to come from this is that this president is weak. And he has created a less certain and more dangerous world for us to live in. And this is just a terrible mistake. And if by some chance Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon in 50 years, maybe this was a stroke of genius. I don't believe that's going to be the result. I believe that Iran will get a weapon, and by lifting the sanctions, they will continue to fund terrorism around the world.
Well, I saw in the news where the Iranian Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah, gave a speech to his people after this whole thing was done, after the UN endorsed the agreement. He said that he vows to defy America and the agreement and do whatever his country deems in their own best interest. And Secretary of State John Kerry said he didn't know how to interpret the leader's words, but found them disturbing. What part of that is hard to understand?
It's not hard for me to understand. It's not hard for most Americans that have a shred of common sense to understand. What the leader of Iran was saying is that he is untrustworthy, that his country is untrustworthy, that we have entered into a foolish negotiation because the other party will not allow verification of the terms, and also is just fundamentally untrustworthy. They will find ways. They have been cheating on agreements for years, and they will continue to cheat on agreements, and we are stupid if we think that this country is somehow going to change its ways. They are a dishonorable country, certainly their leadership, and they will do whatever they need to do to achieve their goals.
Well, it seems like this administration, Congressman, has heeded the first half of the words, the phrase that Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify it. They're trusting but not verifying.
There is no way, Americans can't be part of the inspection team, number one. Number two, and there's a long inspection process which will allow Iran to hide any activity that they're not supposed to be engaged in. All of this is just really poorly thought through, and I think it's an embarrassment that this country, after we have fought wars in the Middle East, and many have sacrificed their lives and others have been hurt, that we would engage in this kind of capitulation.
Congressman Ken Buck, my guest this morning on the Big Morning Show. Let's move on to our next topic. Another very interesting development as the decades-long embargo of Cuba has now come to an end.
Yeah, and no sooner does the Cuban government open an embassy here than they start to talk about how miserable Americans are and what a terrible country we have. I have no idea what prompted the president to again trust a country that has been funding terrorism in our hemisphere and has been a source for running drugs into our country. They have done what they can to undermine our country. They fundamentally disagree with our values. They are communists and remain communists. And even though they've acknowledged that the communist system doesn't work, it's the system that keeps them in power, and they will continue to promote that system. So it's very disturbing. I have a number of friends here in Congress who are Cuban Americans, and they're very concerned about it. The president believes that somehow this will promote human rights in Cuba. I believe that this will make the dictatorship wealthier and give them more resources to repress the beliefs, the efforts of the Cuban people to achieve freedom.
Well, and I guess it legitimizes that regime from the standpoint of the United States recognizing it in that way. But also, I guess something that concerns me, Congressman, is, there are a lot of ties between Cuba and Russia. What is preventing Russia now from using that to infiltrate our country even deeper?
Yeah, nothing. And certainly Russia has engaged in, cyber hacking and other activities that are a threat to this country and giving them a base in Cuba. And I'm sure they have a base in Cuba of activities now. But making Cuba a wealthier country is just creating another wealthy dictatorship as opposed to a free and open society. And it won't happen simply because we normalize relations with them.
Once again, Congressman Ken Buck, my guest this morning. One more topic I wanted to bring up, of course, the tragedy that occurred in Chattanooga, Tennessee. 4 of our Marines shot and killed, a police officer wounded by all accounts is an Islamic terrorist, homegrown there in the Chattanooga area. And while that in and of itself is very disturbing, what I find even more disturbing, Congressman, was the lack of response from the White House.
Yeah, I would think that the president, given his proclivity for issuing executive orders, would immediately issue an executive order allowing American servicemen to possess guns in recruiting centers and military bases and make sure that our service members are protected. I haven't seen that from this president. I think that it is clear that this is not just an isolated incident, that we have had a number of lone terror shootings recently, and that there should be a swift response from this president. He seems very concerned about other acts of violence, which he should be, but he largely ignores anyway, the acts of violence when it involves an illegal immigrant in a sanctuary city or the murder of Marines and a sailor at a recruiting station. It's just a very troubling set of priorities that this president has.
Well, and you mentioned it there as you were talking, this lone shooting, but yet you start to add all of those together and you see just the tip of a very, very, very large iceberg, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. It's clear that by not dealing with the problems that exist in the Middle East, by ignoring those problems, by pretending that America does not need to take a leadership role in this world, we have ended up with problems here at home, and those problems are going to be continue to grow and get far worse.
Something else that bothered me about it was the whole flap over lowering the flags to half staff after this shooting. The president finally did capitulate yesterday and order the flag over the White House to be flown at half mast, but not until an incredible amount of pressure from Americans.
Yeah, again, I think this president is listening to the wrong people and is not showing the appreciation he should show for those who service in the military, those who service in law enforcement, in other professions that really keep us safe here in this country. And it's unfortunate that he does not appreciate the sacrifices that Americans are making.
Yeah, absolutely right. Congressman, I appreciate your time this morning, Congressman Ken Buck. For those who would like to discuss these or any other issues with you, what is the best way to go about doing that?
The best way is to go to our website, which is buck.house.gov, G-O-V, and sign up for our emails and send us emails, and we would love to communicate with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Congressman Ken Buck. Always a pleasure to visit with you, and appreciate your time.